She stood in the middle of the street while her own father counted money into a stranger's hand. Not her dowry, not a gift, her price. 23 years old, and Harold Hartwell was selling his daughter like a broken plow to a man she'd never spoken to in front of every soul in Black Hollow who had already decided she was worthless. The crowd didn't look away. They watched. Some of them smirked, and Eliza Hartwell stood there in the dirt and the heat and did not cry, because she had already cried every tear she had 3 years ago, and she had nothing left to spend on people who weren't worth the salt. This is a work of fiction created entirely for entertainment. All characters, locations, and events are imaginary. If this story finds you, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this one travels. Hit that like button, stay until the end, and let's begin. The trouble with Black Hollow was that it had too much time and not enough water. That was what people said anyway. The town sat in a wide, flat basin between two ridgelines that caught the wind but let the rain pass right overhead, and in the long, dry months between spring and whatever mercy October decided to deliver, the place had a way of turning mean. Not dramatic mean, quiet mean. The kind that settled into porch conversations and Sunday glances, and the particular way a shopkeeper could weigh your flour and make you feel like he was doing you a personal favor just by not throwing it at you. Eliza Hartwell had grown up in that meanness the way some children grow up near a river, so accustomed to the current that she barely noticed it pulling at her ankles anymore. She noticed it now. The morning of the public auction, because that was what it was, no matter what her father called it, was already brutal by 9 o'clock. The sun came up sharp and without apology, the kind of July morning that made the horses pin their ears and the dogs find whatever shade existed and stay there. Main Street was dry enough to crack, the wagon ruts baked hard from weeks without rain, and the smell of dust and livestock and old wood hung over everything like a second sky. Eliza stood outside Calder's General Store and waited. She was wearing her good dress, the blue one with the mended collar, the only piece of clothing she owned that hadn't been handed down from a woman already dead. Her hair was pinned. Her hands were still. From a distance, she probably looked composed. Up close, if you looked at her jaw, you could see the muscle working just under the skin. She had known for 4 days that this was coming. Her father had told her on a Tuesday, standing in the kitchen doorway with his hat already on, as though he couldn't risk coming fully inside for a conversation this short. "Mercer's coming to town Saturday," Harold Hartwell had said. "Widower, got 5 kids and a struggling outfit east of the creek. He needs somebody to help run the house." Eliza had been washing a pan. She'd kept washing it. "He needs a wife," she said. Not a question. "He needs help," her father said. Like there was a difference. She'd set the pan down very carefully. "And what do I need?" Harold had looked at her with that particular exhaustion he'd worn on his face for the better part of 3 years, ever since the marriage to Daniel Fry had collapsed inside of 8 months, and the rumors had started, and the town had taken everything that happened between two people in private and made it into a public referendum on Eliza Hartwell's worth as a woman. "You need a fresh start," he said. "This is the best I can do." She'd wanted to say something. She had a lot of things she'd been storing up for a moment that felt like this one. But Harold had already turned and walked out, and the door had settled shut behind him with that particular quiet click that meant the conversation was over whether she was finished or not. That had been Tuesday. Now it was Saturday, and most of Black Hollow had turned out to watch. She understood later that word had gotten around, the way word always got around in a town this size, traveling faster than any horse, and twice as distorted by the time it arrived. People knew Harold Hartwell was presenting his daughter to Gideon Mercer. They knew about the money. Some of them already had opinions about what that made it. The crowd wasn't enormous. Maybe 30 people, clustered in the uneven shade of the store's awning and along the hitching posts. But 30 people in Black Hollow was most of Black Hollow, and every one of them was watching when Harold Hartwell walked up with Eliza at his side and Gideon Mercer standing 3 feet away with his hat in his hands. Gideon Mercer was not what she'd expected. She'd expected older. She'd expected someone her father's age or past it, a man so far gone that this arrangement was the best he could manage. What she got was a man in his mid-30s, hard through the shoulders and tired through the eyes, with a face that had been weathered into something serious by years of outdoor work. He wasn't ugly. He wasn't handsome, particularly. He looked the way a fence post looks after a rough winter, Functional, durable, stripped of anything unnecessary. He looked at her once when they were introduced, a quick and careful assessment, and then looked away. Not rude, just measured, like he was already calculating what he could and couldn't ask of her. Her father started talking. Eliza stopped listening to the words after a while. She heard the shape of them, Harold's voice going through the old litany she'd memorized through repetition. Good worker, strong girl, just needs the right situation, unfortunate circumstances, nothing wrong with her that time won't fix. She watched the faces in the crowd instead. Martha Greer, who ran the laundry, watching with her arms crossed, and that particular expression she had, like she'd already written the ending and was just waiting for the rest of the story to catch up. Old Pete Calder in his doorway, leaning against the frame. Young Tommy Fisk from the livery, grinning at something one of his friends had murmured. And then Ruth Ambrose, who had been Eliza's closest friend until Daniel Fry had happened and the friendship had quietly dissolved. The way ice dissolves in warm water, not all at once, just less and less until there was nothing left. Ruth Ambrose was standing at the edge of the crowd with her new husband, and she wasn't smiling exactly, but she wasn't stopping it either. That was the one that cost Eliza something. The girl had trouble keeping a husband, her father was saying, and Eliza came back to the present with a jolt. But she's got a strong back and she's not stupid. That's enough, Gideon Mercer said. Harold stopped. The crowd went quiet in that particular way crowds do when something unexpected interrupts a performance they thought they understood. Gideon wasn't looking at Harold. He was looking at Eliza, directly at her, with an expression she couldn't quite name. Not pity, not exactly. Something more like recognition. Like he had looked at her and seen something he hadn't planned on seeing and was adjusting his thinking accordingly. How much? He said to Harold. Now, there's the matter of the arrangement. How much? Gideon said again. Same tone, not louder, just finished with the preamble. Harold named a figure. It was not a large figure. Eliza had learned in the last 4 days not to think too hard about what that number meant in terms of how her father valued the last 23 years of her existence. Some mathematics weren't worth doing. Gideon reached into his coat, counted bills, and held them out. Harold took them. And that was that. Eliza stood in the street while the transaction completed around her, and she thought very clearly and without dramatics. So this is what the bottom looks like. It wasn't despair exactly. It was more like clarity, the kind that comes when you've been halfway expecting a fall for so long that when the ground finally arrives, there's almost a relief in the knowing. You can say no. The voice came low, close to her ear. She turned. Gideon Mercer was standing beside her, close enough that the words didn't carry to the crowd. His hat was back on. In the full sun, his face was harder to read, all shadow and angles. What? She said. I mean it, he said. I need help at the ranch. I've got 5 children and the place is falling to pieces, and I can't do it alone. That's the honest truth of my situation. He paused. But if you don't want to come, you say the word and I'll walk away. Money's already spent. That's between me and your father. You don't owe me anything for it. She stared at him. Why would you do that? He looked out at the crowd, then back at her. Because I watched a man describe his daughter like she was livestock, and I didn't like it. He said it simply, without particular heat. And I've got a daughter of my own. She's 9 years old. And I'd rather lose the ranch than have somebody do that to her someday. Eliza didn't say anything for a moment. Around them, the crowd was beginning to disperse. Conversations restarting, the show apparently over. Her father had already moved toward the store. Nobody was looking at her right now. Your ranch, she said. Tell me about it. Gideon settled his weight slightly, like a man preparing for a longer conversation than he'd planned on. Cedar Creek Ranch, East Valley, about 4 miles out. I've got 300 acres, most of it good land when there's water. Cattle operation. Was larger before my wife passed, been scaling back since. 5 children. Claire's 12, Ben's 11. The twins, Nora and Sam, are 8, and May's 9. He paused. It's a mess, he added. I won't lie to you about that. The house needs work, the garden's gone. The oldest 2 are angry at the world, and I haven't slept 8 straight hours since February. How long ago did your wife die? 14 months. What did she die of? Something shifted in his face. Fever. Came on fast. I'm sorry. I know. He said it quietly. So, will you come? Eliza looked back at the street, at the town that had watched her father count money into a stranger's hand and found it unremarkable, at the store where Ruth Ambrose had stood and done nothing, at the house 3 blocks north where she'd grown up and from which she would not be particularly missed. I'll need to get my things, she said. She had 2 bags. That was it. 23 years reduced to 2 canvas bags that she'd packed the night before, sitting on the edge of the bed she'd slept in since childhood, deciding what was worth carrying and what wasn't. There wasn't as much worth carrying as she'd once thought. Her mother's sewing kit, 3 changes of clothes, a book she'd read so many times the spine had given up, a folded piece of paper that had a pressed flower in it from a different time in her life. She almost left that one behind, then at the last minute put it in. Harold Hartwell was not in the house when she came to collect her things. She didn't know if he'd deliberately absented himself or if it was coincidence. She decided not to think about it too hard. Her younger sister, Clara, not to be confused with Gideon's Clara, she thought, there would be some sorting out to do, was sitting at the kitchen table when Eliza came through. You're really going, Clara said. She was 16, all angles and uncertainty, at that particular age where everything lands with twice its actual weight. Looks that way. Is he a good man? Eliza thought about Gideon Mercer standing in the street, low-voiced, offering her a choice nobody else had bothered to offer. I don't know yet, she said honestly, but he told me I could say no, so that's something. Clara got up and hugged her, hard, the way 16-year-olds hug when they're trying not to cry and doing a mediocre job of it. Write to me, Eliza said. I mean it, write. You're not going to the moon. No, but I'm going somewhere. She walked out with her 2 bags and didn't look back at the house. Not because she wasn't sad. She was sad in a complicated, layered way that she didn't have vocabulary for yet, but there was something else mixed in with it, something she recognized, distantly, as the first clean breath after a long time underwater. Gideon's wagon was waiting at the edge of town. It was not a new wagon. The boards were weathered, one wheel had been repaired with newer wood that didn't quite match, and the horse pulling it was a big gray animal who looked at everything with the mild contempt of a creature who had seen too much to be impressed by any of it. That's Hector, Gideon said, helping her bags into the back. He's bad-tempered in the mornings. It's almost noon. He takes a while to adjust. She climbed up to the bench. Gideon came up beside her, gathered the reins, and they rolled out of Black Hollow without ceremony. The town fell away behind her slowly, the last few buildings, the water tower, the leaning post that marked the edge of the Calder property. Then just road and open country and the hard blue sky overhead. Neither of them talked for a while. It wasn't uncomfortable, exactly. It was more like 2 people measuring the distance between where they'd started and where they were going, and finding it needed some silence to be properly understood. You should know something before we get there, Gideon said eventually. She waited. The children didn't know I was doing this. Today, I mean. I told them I was going to town for supplies. He kept his eyes on the road. Clara. My Clara. She's going to be difficult. She's 12, and she's smart, and she's been the one trying to hold everything together since her mother died. And she's going to see you as a threat to whatever order she's managed to create. That makes sense, Eliza said. Ben's going to be rude. Not mean, just rude. He's 11 and he doesn't know what to do with what he's feeling, so it comes out sideways. Also makes sense. The twins and May will probably be fine. May especially. He paused. She's been sick on and off. Nothing that's killed her yet, but she runs fevers easy. Eliza filed that away. And you? She said. What should I know about you? He considered that for a moment with what appeared to be genuine seriousness. I work too hard and sleep too little, and I've been running on empty so long I don't always remember what full felt like, he said. I'm not easy to talk to when things go wrong because I tend to go quiet, and I know that's not helpful. I'm not going to make you promises I can't keep. Another pause. And I was married for 11 years to a woman who was better at almost everything than I am, and I'm still trying to figure out how to do this without her. It was more honesty than she'd gotten from most people in 3 years. It caught her off guard enough that she didn't answer right away. I'm going to tell you something too, she said. All right, I'm not your wife. I'm not going to pretend to be your wife, and I'm not going to try to be whoever she was. I'll work. I'll take care of your children. I'll do what needs doing. She looked at him directly. But I'm not a replacement for someone else. I'm just me. And I'd like that to be understood from the start. He looked at her then, briefly, with something that might have been respect. Understood, he said. Hector plodded on, bad-tempered and steady, and the road unrolled ahead of them through the dry valley grass. Cedar Creek Ranch came into view in the early afternoon. First the fence line, then the gate with its faded sign, then the buildings themselves rising from the flat ground. A main house that had once been painted white and was now the color of old bone. A barn that leaned slightly to the left like a tired man against a wall. A series of outbuildings in various states of survival. The creek that gave the place its name was running low. She could see it from the gate, a thin glitter of water in a bed meant for much more. The banks cracked and pale where the waterline had retreated. She took it all in without comment. It's worse from the inside, Gideon said, not as an apology, more as information. Most things are. They came through this gate, and the house door banged open, and children poured out. Or most of them did. 4 of them. A cascade of varying heights and expressions, stopping short when they saw the wagon wasn't carrying only their father. The tallest girl, Clara, unmistakably, with her father's serious eyes and her jaw already set in a way that said she'd been waiting to be disappointed and was prepared to be right, stopped at the edge of the porch. The boy beside her, Ben, stared. The 2 small ones who had to be the twins, a girl and a boy, both with the same dark hair, looked at each other first, then at Eliza. And at the back of the group, hanging slightly in the doorway, as if not yet committed to the outdoors, was a small girl with pale skin and eyes a little too large for her face, watching everything very carefully. May, Eliza thought. Gideon climbed down from the wagon and faced his children. This is Eliza Hartwell, he said. She's going to be staying with us for a while, to help. Silence. Clara's eyes moved from her father to Eliza and back to her father with an expression that was not quite anger and not quite hurt, and was maybe the thing that lives in the space between them. You didn't tell us, she said. Quiet. Controlled. More damning for it. No, Gideon said. I didn't. Why? Because I wasn't sure how, he said, which was, at minimum, the honest answer. Clara looked at Eliza. Eliza looked back. She didn't smile. It would have felt false, and she had a feeling this girl could detect false at 50 yards. I know this wasn't expected, Eliza said, and I'm not going to tell you it doesn't matter. It does. You can feel however you want about it. She paused. But I'm here, and I'm going to try to be useful. That's all I can tell you right now. Something moved through Clara's face, too fast to read. She turned and went back inside without another word. Ben watched her go, then looked at his father, then at Eliza. Are you going to try to be our mother? He said. No, Eliza said. I'm not. Ben digested that. Okay, he said, and went inside too, which was possibly the most neutral response he could have given. The twins were still standing there. The girl twin spoke first. I'm Nora, she said. He's Sam. He doesn't talk as much as me. Sam confirmed this by saying nothing. Hello, Nora, Eliza said. Hello, Sam. From the doorway, May hadn't moved. She was watching Eliza with those careful eyes. Are you sick? Eliza asked her, gently. May blinked. Not right now. Good, Eliza said. Then maybe you can show me where the kitchen is. It wasn't a masterstroke. It wasn't some perfect moment of connection that dissolved all the tension and rearranged everything into something beautiful. May just looked at her for another moment, then pushed the door open a little wider. It's through here, she said. Eliza picked up one of her bags and followed the small girl into the house. The kitchen was, as promised, worse from the inside. Not filthy. Gideon had clearly been making an effort, or Clara had, and Eliza would later learn it was mostly Clara, but cluttered in the way that happens when capable hands are stretched too thin for too long. Dishes stacked with the residue of meals that had been practical rather than intentional. A pot on the stove with something dried into the bottom that would require soaking and patience. The window over the sink looked out onto what had once been a kitchen garden and was now a gray rectangle of defeated earth, dry and cracked and faintly optimistic with 2 or 3 scraggly green things still trying against all odds to exist. She stood in the center of it and breathed. Then she put her bag down, rolled up her sleeves, and started doing dishes. Not because it was going to fix anything, not because it was going to make the children like her, or make the drought go away, or resolve the complicated arithmetic of what this arrangement was and what it might become. Just because the dishes needed doing, and she was here, and she was not the kind of woman who stood in a mess and waited for someone else to start. Clara appeared in the doorway behind her and stood there for a moment. Eliza kept washing. "That's my job," Clara said finally. "Not today," Eliza said. "Today it's mine." Another long pause. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to." Clara was quiet for so long that Eliza thought she'd left. But when she turned around, the girl was still there, leaning against the doorframe, watching her with that expression that was too old for 12 and too young for whatever it was trying to be. "She used to hum when she did the dishes," Clara said. Eliza understood who she meant. "What did she hum?" Clara looked at her. "I don't remember anymore," she said, and her voice did something complicated on the last word, cracked just slightly at the edge, like old wood under new weight. She turned and walked away down the hall. Eliza turned back to the sink. She finished the dishes without humming. She didn't know the songs this kitchen had heard, and she wasn't going to pretend to. Outside, the sun moved west across the cracked waiting ground, and the creek ran thin and quiet over its stones, and Cedar Creek Ranch settled into the particular stillness of a place that has survived a great deal and is not yet sure what comes next. Eliza Hartwell dried her hands, looked out the window at the ruined garden, and thought, "Start with the soil. You can always start with the soil." She had no idea yet how true that would turn out to be. The first week was the kind of difficult that doesn't announce itself dramatically. It just accumulates, small thing after small thing, piling up quietly until the weight of it becomes undeniable. Eliza had slept in the small room off the back hallway, the one that had been used for storage until Gideon had cleared it out the day before bringing her home. There was a cot, a window that faced east, and a hook on the wall for hanging things. It was clean enough. It was private. She told herself both of those things mattered and made herself believe it. She was up before the sun, not because anyone asked her to be, not to make a point. She was up because she'd been waking before dawn since she was old enough to be useful, and the habit had outlasted every other part of her old life with stubborn persistence. She dressed in the gray light, found the kitchen, and got the stove going. By the time the sky had turned from black to the particular dark blue that comes just before morning commits to itself, she had coffee on and was standing at the window looking at the garden. It was worse in the early light than it had looked the evening before. The soil had gone to something close to concrete, pale and cracked and hard, the kind of ground that needed a pickaxe before it would accept a shovel. Whatever had been planted there last season had long since given up. 2 tomato cages stood empty in the corner, rusted and leaning. A row of stakes with no string between them, one stubborn bean plant still alive along the south fence, thin as a rumor. She heard footsteps and turned. May was in the doorway in her nightgown, hair loose, feet bare on the wooden floor. "You're up early," Eliza said. "I always wake up early," May said. "My chest gets tight sometimes. Easier to sit up." Eliza looked at her more carefully. The girl's color was fine this morning, nothing alarming, but she was thin in the way children get when their bodies have been spending too much energy on being sick and not enough on simply growing. "Come sit," Eliza said. "I'll get you something warm." May came to the table without argument, which told Eliza she was used to early mornings and probably used to managing herself, which was a particular kind of sad in a 9-year-old. They sat together in the quiet kitchen while the coffee heated and the sky outside went slowly pink, and May told her about the bean plant by the fence, that their mother had planted it, that Clara had been watering it all summer out of something that wasn't quite hope but was the closest word available. Eliza didn't say anything about that. She just listened. By the time Gideon came downstairs, the coffee was ready, and May was still at the table, explaining the ranch's geography with the thorough seriousness of someone who had been paying close attention to their world. Gideon stopped in the kitchen doorway. He looked at his youngest daughter and then at Eliza, and something in his face shifted. Just briefly, just enough to notice. "She wake you?" he said to Eliza. "No, I was already up." He came in and poured himself coffee and stood at the counter drinking it. He looked like a man who had been awake for several hours already, despite only recently getting out of bed, which Eliza was beginning to understand was just his default condition. "I'm going to start on the fence line today," he said. "The east section's been down since May, losing cattle through it. All right? There's a list of things that need doing on the nail by the door." She'd already found the list. It was long, 3 pages in a cramped, practical hand, and it had the quality of something added to over time rather than written all at once. Items layered on top of each other in different degrees of urgency, some crossed out and then rewritten lower down when they'd become urgent again. "I'll start inside," she said. "Work outward." He nodded and took his coffee and went, and that was the extent of the morning's conversation between them, which was fine. Eliza had learned early that some people communicated mostly through what they did rather than what they said, and she suspected Gideon Mercer was deeply, fundamentally one of those people. The children came down in sequence. The twins together, as they apparently did everything, already dressed and already in the middle of a disagreement about something that had apparently started the night before and hadn't resolved during sleep. Sam, it turned out, did speak, just selectively, and mostly to Nora, and mostly to contradict her. Ben came down last, at an hour that suggested he'd been hoping everyone else would simply be gone by the time he appeared. He was tall for 11, already showing the angular awkwardness of someone who was going to be large someday and hadn't worked out what to do with all the advanced materials. He stopped when he saw Eliza at the stove, and his face went through several expressions before settling on neutral. "There's eggs?" she said. "Sit down. I can get my own breakfast." "I know you can. Sit down anyway." He sat, with the particular rigid dignity of someone demonstrating that compliance is not the same as agreement. She put eggs in front of him. He ate them. Clara was not at breakfast. Eliza asked Nora where she was. "She eats later," Nora said. "She says she's not hungry in the mornings." "Is that true?" Nora and Sam exchanged a look. "Not really," Nora said. Eliza understood. Clara was choosing to skip the meal rather than sit at the table with her. That was fine. That was her right. Eliza put a plate in the warming oven and left it there without saying anything about it to anyone. An hour later, when she came back through the kitchen, the plate was gone and the fork was rinsed and sitting in the drying rack. She didn't mention it, neither did Clara. That was how the first 3 days went, a series of these small, careful negotiations that nobody named out loud. The work itself, at least, was something Eliza understood, hard and specific and honest in the way physical labor always is. She went through the house systematically, not rearranging things, not imposing herself on the existing order, just repairing what had broken and cleaning what had been neglected in the quiet accumulation of a household running without enough hands. The parlor window had a broken latch that let the wind in. She fixed it with a piece of hardware she found in the barn toolbox, sitting on the floor for 40 minutes, figuring out the mechanism until it worked properly. The root cellar stairs had a board so rotted through that stepping on it wrong would have sent someone through it. She replaced it with a plank she cut to size in the barn, while Hector watched from his stall with professional disapproval. The ceiling in the hallway had a water stain that had been there long enough to become part of the house's identity, and she couldn't fix what had caused it. That was a roof problem, a later problem. But she patched the worst of the damage from below so it didn't drip in a rainstorm. Clara observed all of this. Not overtly. She didn't stand around watching, but she was always nearby in that particular way of someone who is paying close attention while trying to look like they aren't. On the third afternoon, Eliza was on her knees in the hallway, working on the floorboard that squeaked badly enough to wake the whole house when anyone moved at night, and Clara came to stand in the hallway and crossed her arms. "That one's been like that for 2 years, she said. It had the sound of a challenge, or maybe a test. "Yep," Eliza said. She had a chisel and was cleaning out the gap between the boards, working methodically. "My father tried to fix it." "What did he try?" "Nails. The board's warped underneath. Nails won't hold it flat." Eliza worked the chisel carefully. "It needs to come up, get the subfloor leveled out, then go back down with longer fasteners." A pause. "How do you know that?" "My grandfather taught me," Eliza said. "He believed women ought to know how things worked. Said it was the only real protection against being helpless." She felt Clara considering this. "Our mother couldn't fix things," Clara said. "Not like that. She was better at other things." "Most people are better at some things than others," Eliza said. That's not a flaw. Another silence. Then, I'm going to check on May. She's in the garden, Eliza said. She said she was going to try to water the bean plant. She's not supposed to be in the sun too long. I know. I told her 20 minutes and then come in. She's got about 10 left. Clara looked at her for a moment, that measuring look, the one Eliza was getting used to, and then went down the hall toward the back door. Eliza went back to the floorboard. It didn't squeak after that. It was not a truce exactly. It was more like a very temporary ceasefire, the kind where both sides are still watching each other carefully from their respective positions. But it was something, the thing nobody had told her, or maybe they had, in their way, and she just hadn't fully understood until she was living inside it, was how much grief was still loose in the house. It wasn't dramatic, visible grief. It didn't announce itself. It lived in small places. The particular way Gideon sometimes stopped in the middle of a task and stood very still for a moment before continuing. The way Ben would sometimes get halfway through a meal and push his plate back and leave, and nobody said anything about it. The way Clara organized the kitchen cabinets in a specific order that Eliza slowly realized matched a system she'd been taught by someone no longer there to maintain it. And so she maintained it herself with a kind of fierce, quiet devotion. Eliza didn't try to fix any of that. She didn't know how, and she suspected that trying would make it worse. What she did instead was simply keep showing up, day after day, steady and present and not pretending any of it was easy. 12 days after she arrived, May got sick. It came on fast, the way Gideon had warned her it sometimes did. One evening, May was at the supper table, quieter than usual, picking at her food. By bedtime, her skin was hot to the touch. By midnight, she was shaking with a fever that had climbed to something serious. Eliza heard her through the wall, a thin, unhappy sound that woke her faster than a shout would have. She was in May's room in 30 seconds, her hand on the girl's forehead, and the heat of it made her stomach tighten. "It's all right," she said, though she wasn't sure yet. "I've got you." She went for water first, cold from the pump, which meant the pump in the dark, which meant feeling her way through the kitchen and out to the yard in her bare feet on ground that still held the day's heat. She worked the pump handle until the water ran cold and filled the basin and carried it back. May was sitting up when she returned, shivering and wide-eyed. "I don't want to be sick," May said. It came out small and exhausted. The voice of someone who had said this before and understood it didn't change anything. "I know." Eliza sat on the edge of the bed and began wringing out a cloth. "Tell me what happens when the fever comes. What helps?" "Mama used to put cold cloths on my neck," May said. "And stay with me." "All right." Eliza folded the cloth and laid it against the back of May's neck. "I'm going to stay with you." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She said it the same way she'd said it to Clara over the dishes, and May seemed to recognize something in it, maybe the consistency of it, because she settled back against the pillow without further argument. Gideon appeared in the doorway an hour later, hair disheveled, holding a lamp. "I heard her," he said. His eyes went to May, then to Eliza. "Fever's high, but I think it's going to break," Eliza said. "She was lucid when I came in. I've had her drinking water. If it's not down by morning, we should talk about getting the doctor." "Doc Reyes is in Mill Haven, half a day's ride." "Then let's hope it breaks." He came in and sat in the chair by the window, and they kept watch together in shifts. Eliza for the first portion, then Gideon, then Eliza again. Around 4 in the morning, the fever cracked, the way fevers do when they finally give up the fight, May's skin going from burning to cool and damp, and she fell into a real sleep for the first time since it had started. Gideon was in the chair. Eliza was sitting on the floor beside the bed with her back against the wall, and they were both just there, in the quiet, in the specific exhaustion that comes after something frightening has passed. "She's been like this since she was born," Gideon said. Low. "The fevers, they come out of nowhere. Catherine knew how to handle them." Catherine. The first time he'd said her name out loud to Eliza. "She sounds like she was good at it," Eliza said carefully. "She was good at a lot of things," he said. Then after a pause, "I'm not saying that to make you feel—" "I know," Eliza said. "It's all right." He looked at her in the dim light of the lamp. "May seems—" he started, then stopped. "Seems what?" "She doesn't take to people easily, since Catherine died." He shifted in the chair. She's not talking to you like she talks to strangers. Eliza thought about May at the kitchen table in the pre-dawn quiet, explaining the ranch's geography with the seriousness of a small professor. She's a good kid, she said. All 5 of them are, Gideon said, even when they're being difficult. Especially then, Eliza said. He almost smiled. Almost. In the low light, it was hard to tell, but something in his face softened by a fraction, which was more than she'd seen in the weeks since she'd arrived. May slept through to mid-morning. When she woke up, her fever was gone, she was hungry, and she wanted to know if the bean plant had survived the night. I'll check on it, Eliza told her. You stay in bed until noon. The bean plant can't check on itself, May said. You're right, which is why I said I would do it. Bed until noon, May negotiated. They compromised on 11 o'clock. It was not a perfect arrangement, but it was an honest one, and Eliza was beginning to think that honest arrangements, even imperfect ones, were worth more than perfect ones that nobody actually believed in. Ben was in the yard when she went to check the garden. He was doing something to the far fence that involved a great deal of physical effort and what appeared to be personal grievance, and for a while they existed in the same space without acknowledging each other. Then Eliza found that the bean plant had developed a new problem. Something was eating it, methodically and without remorse, from the bottom up. It's the grasshoppers, Ben said without turning around. They've been at it all summer. Nothing stops them. Diatomaceous earth might, Eliza said. Or wood ash, grasshoppers don't like either. A pause in the fence activity. Where are you going to get diatomaceous earth? Might not need to. Wood ash I can get from the stove. Ben turned around. He was sweaty and had a bruise on his forearm from something, and he looked at her with that suspicious, sideways attention that she'd come to understand as his particular form of interest. Is that real? Wood ash works? It doesn't work perfectly, she said, but it helps. You have to reapply after rain, and we haven't had much of that. No, he said. We haven't. He went back to the fence, but the quality of the silence between them had changed. Just slightly, the way a room changes when a window is opened, not dramatic, just a different quality of air. By the end of the 3rd week, Eliza had developed something like a rhythm with the household. It wasn't smooth. Nothing about Cedar Creek Ranch was smooth, and she'd given up expecting it to be. It was more like learning to walk on uneven ground. You adjusted your balance constantly, you expected the unexpected, and you stopped being surprised when something you thought was solid turned out to have given it. The garden was her largest project and her most uncertain one. She'd spent 4 evenings clearing the hard soil, breaking it up with the pickaxe from the barn, working in compost from the pile behind the hen house that had been sitting unused. Her hands blistered and then calloused. She planted what she could still get in the ground at this late point in the season. Fast-growing things, practical things, nothing that needed months she didn't have. Turnips, late-season beans, some hardy greens. She planted them without ceremony or optimism, just in the ground, where they either would or wouldn't, and she would do her part, and the soil would do whatever it was capable of. Clara watched this project from a distance for several days before she came and stood at the edge of the garden one evening while Eliza was on her knees in the dirt. She planted roses, Clara said. My mother, along the south side. Eliza looked at the south side of the garden. There were the ghost shapes of rose bushes there. Dead, or close to it, the canes dried and gray. Do you want me to try to save them? Eliza asked. Clara looked at the dead canes. Can you? I don't know, maybe 1 or 2. The root systems might still be alive, I'd have to check. My mother spent 2 years getting them established. I know. They were her favorite thing in the garden. Clara. Eliza sat back on her heels and looked at the girl directly. Tell me what you want, not what you think I can do. What you actually want. Clara was quiet for so long that Eliza thought she wasn't going to answer. I want them to live, she said, very quietly. That's what I want. Then I'll try. She spent the next morning carefully checking each of the rose canes, cutting back to wherever there was still life. 2 of them were gone entirely, past saving. 3 had root systems that, with water and time and some aggressive pruning, had a chance. She didn't tell Clara which ones had survived and which hadn't. She just tended the living ones and let the dead ones be, and said nothing about it either way. A week after that, Clara came to find her in the barn, where Eliza was attempting to diagnose a problem with the secondary water pump. "Thank you," Clara said. Just that. Eliza looked up from the pump. "For which part?" "The roses." A pause. "And for not making a big deal about it." "No reason to make a big deal?" Clara stood there a moment longer, with that look that was slowly becoming familiar, the measuring look, slowly adjusting its measurements. "The pump needs a new washer," she said. "My father's been meaning to get one from Calder's." "Do we have anything that would work in the meantime?" Clara thought. "Maybe. Come on, I'll show you the parts box." She led Eliza across the barn to a wooden crate in the corner that contained a decade's worth of old hardware, and they sorted through it together in the afternoon heat, and it was not a breakthrough or a turning point or any of the things that stories like to announce as significant. It was just two people looking through a box of old parts, trying to fix something that was broken, which was, in its way, exactly what the whole ranch was, and exactly what they were all, in their own ways, doing. Gideon noticed. She knew he did, even though he said very little about it. She'd catch him watching sometimes, at supper or when she was in the yard with the children, with an expression that was complicated and kept its own counsel. He was not a man who said things easily. But one evening, when the children were in bed and she was sitting on the porch steps with her boots off and her feet aching from the day, he came out and sat on the step above her and said, "It's getting better." She looked out at the yard, the garden, the thin creek in the distance. "Slowly," she said. "Slowly, still better." She didn't argue with that. The dry air smelled of dust and something green. The turnip seedlings, already pushing up through the broken soil, small and stubborn, and absolutely unbothered by the opinions of anyone who thought they couldn't grow here. "The east fence is holding," he said, "since you helped Ben reset the posts." "He did most of it. He told me you showed him the cement mix." "He figured it out faster than I expected." Gideon was quiet a moment. "He doesn't talk about it, but you should know it means something to him. Someone treating him like he's capable instead of like he needs to be managed." She thought about Ben at the fence, sweaty and determined and trying to look like he wasn't paying attention to anything. "He's capable," she said. "Anyone can see that." "You did," Gideon said, faster than most. He went back inside after that, and Eliza sat on the porch steps until the stars came out properly, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, the horses shifting in the barn, the distant complaint of the creek, the particular silence of this wide-open country that wasn't really silence at all, but a different kind of fullness. She was not happy, exactly. Happy felt like too simple a word for whatever was actually happening. This complicated, exhausting, incremental thing of learning a place and its people and slowly, slowly being learned in return. But she was not what she'd been in Black Hollow either, the woman who had stood in the street while her father counted money into a stranger's hand. The woman the town had written its conclusions about and then stopped paying attention to. Cedar Creek Ranch was still broken in a dozen ways. The water was low. The finances were something she suspected were worse than Gideon had told her. The children were still grieving, still figuring out what they were allowed to feel and what they had to hold. And Gideon himself was still a man carrying something very heavy and not quite knowing how to put it down. But the floorboard didn't squeak. The garden had seeds in the ground. May's bean plant was still alive, protected now by a circle of wood ash that Ben replenished every few days without being asked. And somewhere under the south fence, 3 rose plants that had survived a terrible winter were putting their energy into their roots, quietly deciding whether they had enough left in them to try again. The roses came back. Not all of them. 2 of the 3 Eliza had tended through August put out new growth by September, thin and cautious at first, then with more conviction. Clara found them one morning and stood at the garden fence for a long time without saying anything. When she finally came inside, she didn't mention the roses, but she made breakfast for everyone without being asked, including a plate for Eliza, which she set at the table with the particular careful precision of someone doing something they hadn't planned on doing and were going to commit to anyway. Eliza sat down and ate without making anything of it. That was September. By October, something had shifted in the house. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way seasons shift, where you look up one day and realize the light is different, and you can't quite say when it changed. The twins had started appearing at Eliza's elbow when she worked in the garden, not asking to help, just there, watching, occasionally picking something up and examining it and waiting to be told what it was. Ben had taken over the fence maintenance entirely and extended the repaired section further than Gideon had planned, working with a focused determination that had nowhere else to go. May had claimed a small corner of the garden for herself and planted something she refused to identify, tending it with secretive dedication and checking on it every morning the way other children checked for presents on birthdays. And Clara. Clara was the most complicated and the most important, and the change in her came in installments rather than all at once. She started asking questions, practical questions, about the garden, about the pump, about the household accounts, which Eliza had quietly reorganized into a system that was at least legible, if not exactly encouraging. The questions were always framed as challenges. Why would you do it that way? Why not this other way? But underneath the challenge was genuine curiosity, and Eliza answered every one of them straight, without softening or simplifying. It was Gideon who told her, one evening in November, when a cold front had pushed everyone inside, and the kitchen smelled of wood smoke, and the soup she'd stretched 3 ways to feed 7 people, that Clara had told Ben she thought Eliza was probably not an idiot. High praise, Eliza said. From Clara, it is, Gideon said, and this time he did smile. Not wide, not unguarded, but real. The kind of smile that happens in spite of itself, the kind that costs something and is worth it. Winter came hard and then went grudgingly, the way winters do in the valley, cold enough to be serious, never quite cold enough to be clean about it. Eliza learned the ranch the way you learn a person, slowly, through attention, discovering its habits and its weaknesses, and the particular ways it failed under pressure. The root cellar flooded in January after a wet spell, and she spent 2 days in mud and cold water salvaging what could be salvaged and cataloging what was lost. The barn roof developed a leak over Hector's stall, which Hector registered as a personal offense. One of the older cattle got into something it shouldn't have and had to be watched for a week. Through all of it, Gideon worked beside her in the way he worked, steadily, without complaint, without much conversation. But she was learning to read the language he spoke, which was mostly physical, the set of his shoulders when something was worrying him, the way he slowed down when he was exhausted past the point of acknowledging it, the particular quality of silence that meant he was working through a problem he didn't yet know how to voice. She started leaving coffee for him, not making a production of it, just making sure there was always a cup where he'd find it when he came in from the morning work. He never mentioned it, but she noticed he started coming in from the barn a few minutes earlier than he used to. It was a small thing. So were most things that mattered. Spring arrived, and with it the bills, and with it the... Gideon laid them out on the kitchen table one evening after supper when the children had gone upstairs, spreading papers across the wood with the careful deliberateness of someone who had been avoiding this moment and was now done avoiding it. Land tax, feed costs from the winter, the note on the equipment loan that had been extended twice already, the account at Calder's General, which had grown past the point of comfortable. Eliza sat down across from him and looked at the numbers. She had been raised by a man who kept his finances as private as a confession and as disordered as a barn after a windstorm, so she had learned to read accounts the hard way, by having to sort them out for herself. She was not an expert, but she could read what these numbers said, and what they said was not good. How long? She asked. If this summer is like last summer, so it's 6 months, maybe 8. And if it's worse than last summer? He looked at the papers. Less. She leaned back in her chair. What does the bank want? A payment by August? Significant one. How significant? He told her the number. She kept her face steady. Can the cattle carry it? If prices hold, if we don't lose more head, if... He stopped. There are a lot of ifs. There always are, she said. Tell me the ones you can control and the ones you can't. That conversation lasted 2 hours. At the end of it, they had a list. A real one. Not the 3-page accumulation of everything wrong, but a specific set of priorities in order of what was possible and what had to happen and what was out of their hands. It wasn't a solution. It was more like a map of the problem, which was a different thing, but still better than nothing. I didn't know you could read accounts like that, Gideon said when they'd finished. I didn't tell you everything about me in the wagon, Eliza said. No, he said. I suppose neither of us did. He gathered the papers but didn't leave right away. He sat at the table with his hands around his coffee cup, looking at something in the middle distance that wasn't in the room. She handled all of this, he said. Catherine. I was better at the land. She was better at everything that had to do with making it work. You've been doing both, Eliza said. Badly. You've been doing them alone. That's different from badly. He looked at her. Something in the look had changed from the early days. It was more direct now, less guarded, though still careful. He was a careful man by nature, not from coldness, but from the experience of someone who had learned that things could be lost. You should have told me about the account sooner, she said. Not an accusation, just a fact. I know, he said. I'm not here to be managed, I'm here to help. Those aren't the same thing. I know, he said again. I'm learning that. She let it go. He was learning, so was she. That was about as much as either of them could honestly promise. But the summer that followed those conversations would not give them time to learn at an easy pace. It came in like a punishment, and it came in fast. June arrived without rain. Not unusual. June in the valley was often dry. But July arrived the same way, and the creek, which had run thin through the previous summer and recovered only partially over the winter, began dropping at a rate that made Eliza's stomach tighten every morning when she walked out and checked it. By the middle of July, the water in the creek was below the level of their main intake pipe. Gideon came back from checking the east grazing land one afternoon with a look on his face that she'd learned to take seriously. Not panic, he didn't panic, but a particular bleakness that he only wore when things had moved past, concerning into something worse. The grass is going, he said. I moved the herd west, but there's maybe 3 weeks of decent grazing left over there. After that, we're looking at buying feed or selling cattle we weren't planning to sell. At what price? Drought price, which means terrible. She looked out at the garden. Her turnips had come in. The late beans were struggling but alive. The greens had bolted in the heat, which was a loss, and she'd replanted with what she had left. But the heat was relentless, and even the soil she'd worked so carefully through the fall and winter was starting to crack again in the corners she couldn't water. We need to prioritize the water we have, she said. I know that. No, I mean, specifically. I want to sit down tonight and map every place we're using water and rank them. Because right now we're using the same amount of water on the same things we were in April, and we can't afford that. The cattle need... I know what the cattle need. I also know what the children need, and what the garden needs, and what the horses need, and what we need. And we have to decide what gets what, or we're going to run out of all of it on everything. She looked at him steadily. Tonight, after supper. He looked at her for a moment. All right, he said. Ben had been standing near the barn door during this exchange. He was 15 now, in the way that boys are 15, which is to say, not quite there yet, but close enough to see it. And he'd been listening with the particular focused attention of someone who understood this was serious. I can dig out the secondary channel, he said. The one that used to feed the south tank. It silted up last year, but if I clear it, that's a 3-day job, Gideon said. I know, Sam said he'd help. Gideon looked at his son. Something moved across his face that he didn't put words to. Get started in the morning, he said. Early, before the heat. Ben nodded and went back to what he'd been doing. And Eliza thought, there it is. That's what a boy becomes when someone treats him like he's capable. He becomes someone who sees a problem and offers to solve it instead of waiting to be told what to do. She filed that away too. The drought didn't break. Through the end of July and into August, it doubled down. The sky a blue so hot and pale it looked bleached. The sun doing its work on everything below it without mercy or variation. Cedar Creek Ranch was not the only outfit suffering. The whole valley was in it together, which was cold comfort when you were in it. The Hadley farm 2 miles north sold off half their cattle in early August. Word came that the Prescott family had decided not to renew their grazing lease and were pulling out of the valley entirely. Caleb Monroe, whose land bordered Cedar Creek on the south, came by one afternoon and stood in the yard talking to Gideon with the specific manner of a man trying to convince another man of something. Eliza was in the garden and couldn't hear all of it, but she heard enough. Monroe was talking about a land broker, about an offer, about how these things went sometimes, and there was no shame in recognizing when the land had beaten you. She heard Gideon say, quietly, and without any particular emotion, "Thank you for coming by, Caleb," which was not a yes, but it was not a hard no either. And after Monroe had ridden away, Gideon stood in the yard for a long time looking at the dry creek before he came inside. He didn't bring up Monroe's visit at supper. But after the children had cleared the table, Clara lingered, which she did now sometimes when she sensed the adult conversation was something she needed to be part of. "Monroe offered to connect us to a broker," Eliza said. Not asking, Gideon looked at her. "You heard." "Enough!" Clara's hands had gone still on the table. She was 14 now, and she missed very little. "We're not selling," Clara said. It was not a question. "Nobody said we were," Gideon said. "Monroe thinks you should." "Monroe thinks a lot of things." "Are we going to lose it?" Clara asked. Direct, the way she did everything. "I want the actual answer, not the one you think I can handle." Gideon looked at his daughter, then at Eliza, then back at Clara. "I don't know," he said. "That's the honest answer. I don't know." Clara sat with that for a moment. Eliza watched her work through it. The fear, the anger, the thing that came after both of them that was something closer to resolve. "Then we figure it out," Clara said. "What do we need to do?" Eliza pulled the account papers from where she'd been keeping them, organized now into something legible. She spread them on the table, and the three of them sat around the numbers in the lamplight and talked through it the way it needed to be talked through, plainly, without minimizing, without pretending the situation was other than what it was. It was Eliza who raised the idea of the expanded garden. "We have the south field," she said. "It's not been grazed. If we can get water to it, even if Ben and Sam's channel only delivers half what it used to, and if we plant it now with the fastest maturing crops I can find, we have a chance to bring something to market before the August payment comes due." Gideon looked at the south field through the window as if he could see it in the dark. "That ground hasn't been cultivated in years," he said. "It'll be hard as— I know what it'll be. I've broken hard ground before. The water might not reach. Might not. But it might. Even if it does, the timeline— Gideon." She waited until he looked at her. "I'm not telling you it's going to work. I'm telling you it's the best option we have that doesn't involve Monroe's land broker. So unless you have a different idea, that's what I'm proposing we try." A silence. "I'll help," Claire said. Gideon looked at his daughter. Then he looked at Eliza, and the look had something in it that was harder to name than respect. Something that was still taking shape, something he wasn't ready to say out loud. "All right," he said. "We try." They called it the Last Chance Garden, though not aloud, not officially. That was just what it was. Eliza started breaking the south field the next morning before the sun was fully up, working with the heavy pickaxe because the mattock alone wasn't equal to what the drought had done to that ground. Ben worked beside her, and then Sam, and then, on the third day, to Eliza's surprise, Clara appeared in work clothes with her hair tied back and took up the second pickaxe without comment and worked until her palms bled, at which point Eliza made her stop and wrap her hands before continuing. "You don't have to," Eliza started. "I know," Clara said, with a look that made clear she'd heard that phrase enough times to have adopted it as her own. Eliza wrapped Clara's hands and they went back to work. Nora brought water. Sam kept account of the rows. May, who was not supposed to be in the sun, stationed herself in the shade at the field's edge with a notebook and a serious expression and announced she was keeping records, which nobody argued with because she was keeping records. Careful, accurate ones, dated and measured. Gideon came and went. He had the cattle to manage, the remaining water supply to monitor, the endless small emergencies that a drought produced daily. But when he had hours to spare, he worked the field too, and sometimes Eliza would straighten up from a row and find him working 12 feet away, and they would exchange a look that wasn't quite anything she had language for yet, just acknowledgement, shared weight. The seeds went in. Radishes, fast-maturing beans, turnips again. A variety of squash she'd traded some of her canned goods to get from a woman in town who'd managed to save seed from the year before. Not glamorous crops, not profitable ones, necessarily, but food, and potentially saleable food, if the water held. The channel Ben and Sam had cleared began delivering a trickle to the south tank in the second week of August. A trickle was not enough. Eliza extended the irrigation furrows herself, calculating angle and flow with the kind of practical geometry she'd worked out through trial and error rather than any formal education, digging by hand in the hours before dawn when the air was cool enough to work in without it being dangerous. Gideon found her there one morning at 4 o'clock on her knees in the dark with a lantern, digging. He didn't say anything. He picked up the second shovel and got to work beside her. They dug for 2 hours before the sky began to lighten. When they finally stopped and straightened and looked at what they'd done, the eastern horizon was going pale gold and the furrows ran clean and functional from the channel to the planted rows. "You should sleep," he said. "So should you. I've been saying that to myself since February." She looked at him in the early light. He looked not good, she thought. Not good at all. The drought had cost everyone something, but it had cost Gideon in a particular way, working itself into the lines of his face and the set of his shoulders, wearing down whatever reserves he'd been running on for the better part of a year. "When did you last eat a full meal?" she asked. "I eat." "That's not what I asked." He looked at her. "I'm serious," she said. "You can't run a ranch on half rations and 4 hours of sleep. You're going to—" "I'm fine." "You're not," she said. "And I'm not saying that to be difficult. I'm saying it because it's true, and because someone needs to say it to you, and apparently nobody has." He was quiet. "You've been doing this whole thing, on the edge of nothing for over a year," she said. "Before I got here, before anyone helped. You kept this place alive on sheer stubbornness and exhaustion, and I understand why, and I'm not saying it wasn't necessary, but Gideon, you have to let somebody help carry it. That's what I'm here for. She stopped. "That's what I want to do." The last sentence had come out differently than she'd planned. Quieter. More honest than she'd intended. He looked at her with those tired eyes and the expression that was still working something out. "I know," he said. And then more quietly, "I know." 3 days later, he collapsed. It happened in the afternoon, in the heat of the day when he'd pushed himself to check on the herd's water supply. Ben found him by the south gate, on the ground, the horse standing patient and confused nearby. Ben had enough presence of mind not to panic, or to save his panic for later, which was about as much as anyone can ask of a 15-year-old in that moment. He came running for Eliza. She was at the south field when she heard him shout, and she was moving before she'd consciously decided to move, crossing the dry ground at a run, the sun brutal and indifferent overhead. Gideon was conscious by the time she reached him, trying to sit up, which she stopped by putting a hand on his chest. "Stay down." Stay down, Gideon." He was burning with fever. Not the same kind as May's, not the sudden explosive fever of a child's immune system, but the deep bone-level heat of a body that had been running past its limit for too long and had finally reached the place where it simply stopped cooperating. She got him back to the house. Ben on one side, Eliza on the other, Gideon complaining the entire way in a way that would have been almost funny if he hadn't been so clearly struggling to stay upright. She put him in bed. She got water. She sent Clara for Doc Reyes with instructions that were specific and calm and left no room for argument. And then she stood in the hallway outside his bedroom door and took one breath, just one, just long enough to feel the full weight of where they were, drought, debt, a field of seeds that might or might not survive, a household of children, and the man who was supposed to be holding all of it together, currently unable to sit up without help. One breath. Then she went back into the room and got to work. "You have to let me handle things," she told him. He was looking at the ceiling with the frustrated blankness of a man who is too sick to argue and too stubborn to accept it. "The cattle. Ben and I will manage the cattle. The south field water. I know the south field. I built the irrigation furrows, Gideon. I think I can maintain them. The bank. August is 2.5 weeks away. Focus on getting well. I'll handle what needs handling." He looked at her. His eyes were fever-bright and tired and something else, something that was trying to find words and not quite getting there. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "Let somebody else—" "I know you don't," she said. "Do it anyway." He closed his eyes. Outside, the sky was still that bleached, merciless blue, and the sun was still bearing down on the south field where the seeds were in the ground, and the creek was still running thin over its pale stones, and somewhere beyond the valley the clouds that had been absent all summer were doing whatever clouds did when they were deciding. Eliza changed the cloth on Gideon's forehead, stood up straight, and walked out to meet the rest of the day. The ranch was hers to run now. She had no idea yet if she was equal to it. But she was the one standing, and she was not going to sit down. Doc Reyes came out the following afternoon, a small, unhurried man in his 60s, who had the manner of someone who had seen enough of human suffering to have stopped being dramatic about it without having stopped caring. He examined Gideon, asked questions in a quiet voice, and came out of the bedroom to find Eliza waiting in the hallway with her arms crossed, and her expression arranged into something calmer than she felt. "Exhaustion fever," he said. "Not infection, not anything communicable. His body just stopped." He looked at her over his glasses. "He needs a week of rest, real rest, not the kind where he gets up after 2 days because he thinks he's fine. I'll make sure of it." Doc Reyes studied her for a moment with the particular attention of a man who has made accurate assessments of people's characters through long practice. "I heard about you," he said, "from town." "I imagine you did. I also heard about what you've been doing out here." He picked up his bag. "Those people don't know what they're talking about, for what it's worth." "It's worth something," she said. "Thank you." After he left, she stood in the hallway for a moment with her hand on the wall and let herself feel, briefly, the full size of what she was carrying. Not to wallow in it, she didn't have the time or the temperament for that, but because she'd learned that pretending a weight wasn't heavy didn't make it lighter. You had to acknowledge the thing before you could figure out how to carry it. Then she went to the kitchen where the 4 older children were waiting with the specific tense quiet of people who have been not talking about something. "He's going to be all right," she said. "Doc says exhaustion. He needs a week in bed." Ben let out a breath that he'd apparently been holding for a while. Clara's jaw unclenched by a degree or two. The twins looked at each other, having the silent conversation they were always having. "Who's going to run things?" Clara asked. "We are," Eliza said. "All of us. Together." Clara looked at her steadily. "Tell us what to do." So she did. She organized it the way she'd organized everything at Cedar Creek, practically without ceremony, accounting for what each person could actually do rather than what would be ideal in a world with more time and resources. Ben took primary responsibility for the cattle, which he'd been moving toward for months anyway, and Eliza walked the grazing rotation with him that first morning, so they were working from the same information. Clara took the household accounts and the supply management, because Clara had her father's head for numbers and her mother's organizational instinct, and there was no point leaving that capacity unused out of some notion that she was too young. The twins worked the garden under Eliza's direction, which meant they argued constantly with each other and periodically with her and got the work done anyway. May kept her records and occasionally offered observations that were more useful than anyone expected from a 9-year-old. And Eliza ran the rest of it: the irrigation, the decisions, the daily assessment of where they were and what the next 48 hours required. She slept 4 hours a night. She was up before the sun and working after it went down. She did not complain about this because complaining cost time she didn't have, and because she was running on something that wasn't quite determination and wasn't quite anger. Some compound of both, mixed with something she couldn't name that kept pushing her forward when the reasonable thing would have been to stop. Gideon was a difficult patient. She had expected this, because she had spent enough time with him to understand that lying still while things needed doing was approximately his worst nightmare. By the second day, he was trying to sit up and get to the window to see the cattle. By the third day, he had gotten as far as the doorway before she found him there, holding the door frame, looking out at the yard with the expression of a man watching his house burn from the inside of a glass box. "Back to bed," she said. "I just want to see—" "I know what you want to see. Ben moved the herd to the northwest corner this morning. The secondary irrigation is holding. The south field is still standing." She took his arm. He was thinner than he should have been, she noticed, and warmer than she liked, though the fever had come down from its peak. "Come back to bed and I'll tell you everything." He came back. Not gracefully, not without resistance, but he came. She sat in the chair by the window and gave him a full accounting. The state of the cattle, the water levels, the garden, the finances. She didn't soften any of it. He'd asked her months ago in a different context not to manage him, and she'd taken that seriously. "The radishes are coming in," she said. "Faster than I expected. The beans are close. The squash is still uncertain, but it's alive. The payment's in 11 days. I know when the payment is. Even if everything comes in—" "It's not going to be enough on its own," she said. "I know that too." She paused. "I've been talking to Harlan Briggs." Gideon looked at her. Harlan Briggs ran the largest produce operation in Millhaven and supplied 3 counties. He was not easy to deal with. Eliza had ridden into town on the second day of Gideon's fever, leaving Ben in charge, to have a conversation she'd been thinking about for 2 weeks. Briggs wants first option on everything we bring in, she said. He'll pay above drought price because he's selling to markets that aren't in the drought zone. It won't cover everything, but combined with a smaller cattle sale, 6 or 8 head, not the whole operation, not at disaster prices, and some renegotiating on the equipment note timeline, I think we can get to the number. He was quiet. I can't guarantee it, she said. I want to be clear about that. It depends on the crops coming in, on Briggs's offer holding, on the bank agreeing to the modified timeline. She looked at him. But it's what I have. When did you do all this? He said. The Briggs conversation, the bank, while you were sleeping. He looked at the ceiling. Something moved through his face that was too complicated to read in a single pass. I should have gone to Briggs myself, he said, months ago. Probably, she said, but you didn't, and that's over, and here we are. You rode to Millhaven alone. I've ridden places alone before. Eliza. He said her name the way he said it now, not the careful, measured way of the first months, but something more direct, something that indicated he was actually talking to her, not to the situation she represented. I need you to understand something. She waited. I brought you here because I needed help. He said it to the ceiling, not to her, which was how he said things that cost him. That was what I told myself, practical. A household needs running. 5 children need someone. He stopped. But watching you these last weeks, watching you with May, with Ben, with Clara, he finally looked at her. You didn't have to do any of that the way you did it. You didn't have to care about any of it the way you clearly do. No, she said, I didn't. Why do you? She thought about how to answer that honestly, because she wasn't going to give him a simple answer to a question that wasn't simple. Because somewhere in the last year, she said, this stopped being a situation I was surviving and started being a place I actually wanted to be. She held his gaze. I didn't plan that. It just happened. He was quiet for a long moment. I don't know what I'm doing, he said. With this, with whatever this is becoming. I know you don't. Catherine was... He stopped. Started again. I'm not trying to replace... Gideon. She leaned forward slightly. I know, I've always known. And I'm not asking you to sort all of that out right now. I'm asking you to rest for 6 more days and let me handle the ranch. That's all I'm asking today. He looked at her for a long moment. There was something in the look that hadn't been there a year ago, something that was still finding its shape, still becoming whatever it was going to be. 6 days, he said. 6 days. Then I want to be involved in the Briggs negotiation. Then get well so you can be. He almost smiled. She stood up and adjusted the window so the afternoon light wasn't in his eyes, and went back to work. The rain came on a Tuesday. It didn't announce itself with dramatic thunder or the romantic advance of visible clouds building on the horizon. It just arrived. Eliza was in the south field checking on the squash when the first drops came, large and uncertain, the kind of rain that seems to be testing the situation before committing to it. She looked up. The sky had gone the color of old pewter while she hadn't been watching. Then it committed. She stood in it for a moment without moving, just stood in the rain in the south field with her face turned up, the water hitting the dry ground around her and releasing that specific smell that dry earth makes when it finally gets what it's been waiting for. A smell that she had associated since childhood with the particular relief of things turning around. She heard shouting from the direction of the house and turned to see all 4 older children running across the yard toward her. Or not toward her exactly, toward the field, toward the rain. Sam and Nora already drenched and apparently delighted about it. Ben running with an expression he would have been embarrassed to have witnessed. Clara at the back, not running exactly but walking fast. Her face turned up to the sky in a way that stripped 12 years of careful management off it, and left something younger and less armored underneath. May was on the porch, which was where she was supposed to be in weather, watching with her notebook open. Ben reached Eliza first, sliding slightly in the mud that was already forming at the field's edge. Is it enough? He said. Practical, even now, even soaking wet. His mother's son, she thought. I don't know yet, she said. We need at least an inch to matter. Ask May to check the rain gauge. He turned and shouted toward the porch. May, who had apparently already been thinking along the same lines, held up the gauge and shouted back a number that made Eliza close her eyes briefly. It was still raining. Clara appeared at her shoulder. She was wet, her hair loosened from its pins, and she looked younger than 14, not in a bad way, just in the way of someone who has put down something heavy for a moment. "The roses," she said. "They needed this." "They did," Eliza agreed. They stood in the rain together for a while. The two of them, in the south field with the squash and the beans and the turnips, soaking up the water they'd been waiting for. And it was not a moment that tidied everything up or resolved what was still complicated between them. Clara was still grieving her mother. Eliza was still the woman who had arrived uninvited and rearranged the household's gravity. None of that was simple. But they stood in the rain together, and that was something. Gideon heard the commotion from his bedroom, and by the time Eliza came back inside, he was at the window, out of bed, which she was going to address, but standing at the window with his hand on the glass, looking at the rain in the south field with an expression that was too private to look at directly. She stopped in the doorway. "It might be enough," she said. He nodded. He didn't turn around right away. "I can hear them out there," he said. His voice had something in it that wasn't quite steady. "I haven't heard them make noise like that in—" He didn't finish. "I know," she said. He turned from the window. He looked at her, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, wide open in a way she suspected he hadn't intended, hadn't planned for, that the sound of his children in the rain had cracked open before he could manage it into something more controlled. "Come sit down," she said. "You've been on your feet too long." He came and sat, and she sat across from him, and for a few minutes neither of them said anything while the rain came down outside and the children shouted in it and the south field drank. "I want to tell you something," Gideon said. He was looking at his hands. "All right. I've been watching you since the beginning." He paused. Not in a strange way, just another pause. He was not built for this kind of speech, and they both knew it. "Every time something went wrong, I expected you to recalculate, decide it wasn't worth it. I kept waiting for you to leave." "I didn't leave." "No." He looked up. "Why?" She thought about the first morning at the kitchen window, looking at the dead garden. She thought about May's hand in hers during the fever, Ben's face when she'd treated him like someone capable, Claire's voice saying, "I want them to live," about the roses, barely above a whisper. "Because somewhere it stopped being about staying," she said, and started being about not wanting to go. He held her gaze for a long moment. "I need you to know—" He stopped, tried again. "What I'm trying to say is that it's not gratitude, what I feel. It's not just—" He made a short, frustrated sound. "I'm bad at this." "You're working on it," she said. "That's enough for right now." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not dramatically, not with any great performance, just put it there and left it and looked at her. She turned her hand over and held his. They sat that way while the rain came down outside. The next 10 days were the hardest kind of hard. Not dramatic, not crisis level, but the grinding, detail-intensive work of trying to make numbers line up that didn't naturally want to. Gideon was on his feet by day 6, which was one day earlier than she'd wanted, but she'd negotiated him down from day 3, so she counted it a partial success. They went to Harlan Briggs together. Eliza had laid the groundwork. Gideon knew the cattle market and the production numbers in the way that came from decades of working the land. Between them, they had something more complete than either would have had alone, and Briggs, who was a pragmatic man above everything else, made an offer that was not generous but was fair, and they took it. The first harvest from the south field came in lighter than Eliza had hoped and heavier than she'd feared. The radishes were good. The beans came in strong on the south rows, less so on the north where the water hadn't quite reached. The squash, the uncertain, stubborn squash she'd watered by hand on the driest days when the irrigation failed, came in better than anyone had expected, and it was the squash, ultimately, that made the difference. She was at the kitchen table the night before the bank payment was due, going through the final numbers with Clara, who had become indispensable to this process in a way that nobody had originally planned, when she arrived at a figure that made her set down her pencil. Clara looked at her. "What?" Eliza checked it again. "We're going to make it," she said. Not loudly, not with great drama, just as a fact that had taken a long time to become one. Clara stared at the numbers. Her jaw worked for a moment. "By how much?" she said. "Not much, but enough." Clara pressed her lips together. She was 14, and she had kept her composure through most of the summer with a rigidity that Eliza recognized because she'd practiced the same thing herself at that age and was still practicing. "Okay," Clara said. Her voice was slightly uneven. "Okay, good. You did good work," Eliza said. "These accounts, you kept them more accurately than anyone asked you to. That mattered." Clara looked at the table. "My mother taught me," she said. "I didn't want to. I wanted it to still matter, what she taught me." "It did," Eliza said. "It does." They sat at the table for another few minutes, not working, just letting the evening settle around them. Through the window, the yard was dark and the sky was clear. Since the rain 3 weeks ago, it had rained twice more. Nothing like a full recovery, but enough to change the character of the land, enough to give everything a chance. Gideon came in from checking the barn and found them there. He looked at their faces. "Tell me," he said. "We're going to make the payment," Eliza said. He stood in the kitchen doorway. He put one hand against the doorframe, which was a thing she'd noticed him do when he needed a moment. Just something solid to hold on to while he processed something. "All of it?" "All of it." He looked at the ceiling for a moment. When he looked back down, his eyes were not dry, which he made no effort to hide, and she loved him a little more for that. This man who was so private with himself, choosing not to manage this particular moment into something more controlled. "Clara did the accounts," Eliza said. He looked at his daughter. Clara shrugged, an elaborate and unconvincing gesture of nonchalance. "The numbers weren't that complicated," she said. Gideon crossed the kitchen and pulled her into a hug that Clara initially resisted with her whole body, and then abruptly didn't, dropping her head against his shoulder with a small, involuntary sound like something breaking and being set free at the same time. Eliza got up quietly and went to the window, giving them the moment. Outside, the yard was still and dark, and the creek was running, not full, not what it had been, but running, audible from the house for the first time in 2 months, and that sound was one of the better things she'd heard in a long time. She heard Gideon's footsteps behind her after a while. Clara had apparently gone upstairs. He stopped beside her at the window. "I owe you something," he said. "You don't." "Eliza!" That direct quality in his voice again. "I brought you here under circumstances that were not good. You didn't ask for this. You didn't choose any of it cleanly." He was quiet for a moment. "And you stayed, and you fought for this place like it was already yours." He paused. "I want to know if you'd consider making it actually yours." She turned to look at him. He met her eyes. He was not performing anything. There was no management to it, no careful calculation. Just a man in his own kitchen asking something real. "I'm not good at this," he said. "Saying things. You know that." "You're getting better," she said. I can't promise it's going to be easy. I'm still figuring out a lot of things. The kids are still..." "Gideon." He stopped. "I know your children," she said. "I know this house. I know this land. I know that you go quiet when things go wrong. And I know that you wake up before the alarm. And I know you can't walk past a broken fence without fixing it even when you're exhausted." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not marrying an idea. I know what I'd be marrying." "Is that a yes?" "It's a yes." He let out a breath. Long, slow, the breath of someone who has been braced for something and can now stop bracing. He reached out and tucked a piece of hair away from her face, an unexpectedly gentle gesture from hands she'd mostly seen holding tools and reins and fence posts, and the gentleness of it was what got her, more than anything else, that careful and uncertain tenderness from a man who had been carrying so much alone for so long. "I'm going to try," he said, "to be better at this. At saying things." "I know you will," she said. "I'll be here while you figure it out." They told the children the next morning at breakfast when everyone was at the table. Not dramatically, Gideon simply said plainly that he'd asked Eliza to marry him and she'd said yes. The twins' response was immediate and loud and involved what appeared to be a preliminary plan for the wedding that neither of them had any intention of waiting to be asked about. Ben looked at Eliza for a long moment. Then he said, "It's about time," in a tone of profound adolescent weariness, and went back to his eggs. May said nothing, but she got up from her chair and came around the table and put her arms around Eliza's waist with the particular grip of someone who is not saying something in words because the words aren't big enough. Eliza held her. Clara was the last. She sat at her end of the table with an expression that went through several things in the span of 30 seconds. Things Eliza watched without trying to manage, because they were Clara's to feel, and they were real, and they deserved the space. Then Clara looked at her father, then at Eliza, then at her hands. "She would have liked you," she said, very quietly. "My mother." She paused. "I think she would have liked you." The table went quiet. Eliza felt the weight of that, the size of what it cost a 14-year-old girl to say, the particular courage of it. "I would have liked to know her," she said, and meant it. The bank payment was made on a Thursday. Gideon came home from Millhaven with the receipt and put it on the kitchen table, and Eliza picked it up and read the numbers and put it back down. And that was the end of that particular crisis. Not the end of everything hard. The ranch still had debt, less of it, structured better, but present. The land was recovering from the drought slowly, the way land does, which is stubbornly and on its own schedule. The cattle herd was smaller than it had been and would take years to rebuild. The house still needed a new roof over the east wing, and the barn's lean hadn't gotten any less pronounced, and there were 100 things on the list that hadn't moved yet. But Cedar Creek was theirs, not lost. Not sold to Monroe's broker or anyone else. Theirs. That evening, Eliza walked out to the south field alone, in the long, late summer light that makes everything it touches look like it's being held. The field that had been concrete and dead 3 months ago was transformed. Picked over now, the crops largely harvested, but the soil broken and alive. The furrows Ben had helped her dig still faintly visible. The whole field smelling of turned earth and the particular green and mineral smell of a place that has been worked and watered and coaxed back into productivity. She thought about Black Hollow, about the street and the sun and her father's hands counting money, about the crowd and its 30 faces and the particular sound of silence that feels like consensus. She thought about how certain she'd been, riding out of town on that wagon, that she was going from one kind of hard to another, that rescue and trade might just be different words for the same thing. She hadn't been wrong to worry. It had been hard. It was still hard most days, in the specific and unglamorous ways that real life is hard. Nothing about Cedar Creek had been given to her. She dug for every inch of it, sometimes literally. But standing in the south field in the evening light, with the sound of the children's voices carrying from the house, and the smell of living soil around her, and a man inside who had asked her to stay, not because he needed someone to fill a role, but because he didn't want her to go. She thought that there was a version of herself, standing in that street a year ago, who would not have recognized this, would not have believed it was available. The roses were blooming. She'd noticed them yesterday. Just a few flowers, tentative. Not the full bloom they'd have next spring when they'd had time to properly recover, but real, red, undeniable. Clara had found them before Eliza and hadn't said anything about it. She'd just come to supper that evening and helped set the table and sat down, and something in her face had been different, quieter, less like armor. Eliza stood in the field until the light went gold and long, and then began to fail. And then she turned and walked back toward the house where the lamp was already on in the kitchen window, warm against the coming dark, and went inside. They married in October, when the heat had finally broken and the valley had turned that particular shade of gold that made even the hardest used land look like something worth fighting for. It was not a large wedding. Neither of them wanted large. Eliza because she'd had enough of performing for an audience in Black Hollow to last several lifetimes, and Gideon because he was constitutionally unsuited to ceremony and would have been miserable trying to pretend otherwise. What they had was the minister from Millhaven, the children, Doc Reyes, and old Harlan Briggs, who showed up uninvited but brought a bottle of something good and was forgiven on that basis. Clara had asked 2 weeks before if she could do something with the roses. "What did you have in mind?" Eliza said. "Just cut a few. For the table, if that's all right." "It's your garden as much as mine," Eliza said. "Do whatever you want with them." Clara had cut 4 roses and arranged them in a jar on the kitchen table where they stood for the ceremony, simple and imperfect and exactly right. Nobody commented on where they'd come from or what it meant that they were there. Nobody needed to. Ben stood through the ceremony with his arms crossed and his expression carefully neutral, which by now Eliza had learned was his version of moved. Sam watched with the focused attention he gave everything important. Nora cried cheerfully and without embarrassment, which was very much in character. May stood close to Eliza's side and held her hand through the whole thing, small fingers wrapped around hers, and Eliza held on. Gideon said his part in the plain, direct way he said everything. Not eloquent, not performed, but completely meant. When he looked at her, it was the same look he'd been giving her in unguarded moments for months now. The look of a man who has been surprised by something and has decided to be grateful for it rather than frightened. She said her part back to him the same way. Afterward, Briggs opened the bottle and Doc Reyes told a story that went on too long and was funny anyway, and the twins somehow turned the evening into a competition that nobody had agreed to enter, but everyone ended up participating in. And the kitchen was loud and warm and imperfect in all the ways a family occasion is imperfect. And Eliza stood in the middle of it and thought, this is what I didn't know I was riding toward. The years that followed were not easy. She wanted to be honest about that, even in memory. Especially in memory, because it was easy to let time smooth the difficult parts into something more comfortable than they'd actually been. The ranch had survived the drought, but surviving and recovering were different animals entirely. The cattle herd took 3 years to rebuild to a size that made the operation properly profitable. There were 2 more dry summers in the 5 years after the crisis. Neither as bad as that one, but neither good, and each one required a version of the same calculation. What do we have? What do we need? Where is the gap? And how do we close it? They got better at the calculation each time, faster and less frightened, though never entirely unafraid. Gideon learned slowly and imperfectly to say things. Not all things. There were rooms in him that stayed private, that she understood were his to keep, and she didn't press on them. But the important things. He got better at the important things, and when he failed at it, she'd learned to read the silence well enough to know what was in it, and that was its own kind of fluency. She had been right about what she said on the wagon that first day. She never became Catherine. She didn't try to, and she didn't want to, and over time the children stopped needing her to be. Catherine's roses bloomed every summer, and every summer Clara tended them with the devotion of someone keeping a promise, and that was how it should be. The dead were not replaced. They were carried, and eventually the carrying became less like a wound and more like something structural, part of how you were built. Ben was the first to leave for something larger. He was 17 when he started talking about agricultural college in a way that was tentative at first. Not asking permission, not quite, but testing the air, the way someone does when they want a thing, but aren't sure they're allowed to want it. Eliza had watched him doing this for weeks before she said anything. You should apply, she told him one evening when they were fixing the section of fence that always seemed to need fixing, regardless of how many times it was repaired. He looked at her. It costs, we'll figure that out, apply. Dad needs help here. Your father has been running this ranch since before you could walk. He can manage. She handed him a fence post. You're not the kind of person who stays somewhere because leaving feels disloyal. You're the kind who stays because it's right. And right now, going is right. Ben held the fence post. He was tall now, genuinely tall, and his face had settled into something serious and capable that still occasionally surprised her with its resemblance to his father at a particular angle. You always do that, he said. Do what? Say the thing that makes it easier to know what I actually think. That's not me, she said. That's you. I just say it out loud. He went to college the following autumn. He wrote letters that were long and detailed and revealed more about his interior life than his conversation ever had, which Eliza had privately predicted and never mentioned. He came home for summers and holidays and grew into the kind of young man who made things work and could explain why they worked, which turned out to be an extraordinarily useful combination. Clara stayed longer, not because she lacked options, she was sharp enough that options found her, but because she'd made her own peace with Cedar Creek in a way that made her want to understand it fully before she moved past it. She apprenticed herself to a woman in Millhaven who did accounting and bookkeeping for several businesses, riding in 3 days a week through her 16th and 17th years, and by the time she was 18, she had clients of her own and a reputation in 2 counties for accuracy and discretion. The day she told Eliza she'd been offered a position in the city, a real position, with a firm, the kind of work that would have been unthinkable for a woman from a ranch a generation earlier. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup and her expression doing the complicated thing it did when she was feeling too many things at once. "I don't know if I should go," Clara said. "Why not?" "Because—" She stopped, started again. It still needs—" "Clara." Eliza sat down across from her. "Look at me." She looked. "Your mother kept those roses alive for 2 years before they were established enough to survive on their own," Eliza said. "She didn't stay next to them every day for the rest of her life. She planted them right and let them grow." Clara pressed her lips together. "You have been keeping things running here since you were 12 years old," Eliza said. "Before I arrived. Through the drought, through every hard thing. You did that because you had to, and you were extraordinary at it, and now you don't have to anymore." She held Clara's gaze. "You get to go." Clara was quiet for a long moment. "Do you mean that?" she said. "Not just, I mean it completely." Clara nodded. She looked down at her coffee cup and then back up, and her eyes were wet in the way they got when she wasn't going to cry, but was close to the border of it. "She'd be proud of you," Eliza said. Carefully. She didn't use Catherine's name often. She used it when it mattered. Clara's breath caught. "You didn't know her." "No, but I know what she built, and I know you." She reached across and put her hand over Clara's. "She'd be so proud." Clara left for the city 6 weeks later. She came back for every holiday for the next decade, and later, when she had a family of her own, she came back with them. And her children grew up knowing Cedar Creek the way children know beloved places, which is completely and specifically and with the kind of devotion that only comes from being genuinely welcome. The twins went different directions, as twins sometimes do once the world opens up wide enough to offer real divergence. Nora went north to train as a nurse, which suited her in a way that seemed obvious in retrospect. She'd always been the one who appeared when someone was hurting, without being asked, without making a performance of it. Sam stayed in the valley, ended up working the land 2 properties over, and was the child who came home most often and most practically, showing up when something needed fixing without necessarily announcing his arrival first, which Gideon appreciated more than he said and showed more than he needed to. May was the surprise. May, who had spent her childhood being sick and keeping records and watching everything with those careful eyes, May turned out to have a mind for science that her school teacher in Mill Haven identified early and pushed relentlessly. And by the time she was 16, she was reading material 3 grades above her level and conducting small experiments in the barn that Gideon pretended not to notice, and Eliza occasionally pretended not to see the evidence of. She won a scholarship at 18 that paid for 3 years of study, and she became, in time, with a great deal of work and a stubbornness that anyone who'd watched her tend that bean plant through a drought would have recognized immediately, a botanist. She came home with notebooks full of drawings of plants and questions about soil composition, and once spent an entire visit taking samples from the south field that Eliza had broken with a pickaxe years before, analyzing the soil recovery and explaining the results with a focus that reminded Eliza, achingly and exactly, of a 9-year-old girl in the shade at the field's edge with a notebook, announcing she was keeping records. "You always were," Eliza told her. May had looked up from her samples with a smile that was the same smile, just larger. "I learned it was worth doing." Cedar Creek Ranch grew in the way things grow when they've survived the worst and come out the other side knowing what they're made of. Gideon added the northeast parcel when it came available. They bought it at a fair price rather than a desperate one, which felt significant, a measure of how far they'd come from the August when they'd barely held on to what they had. The cattle operation expanded back to its previous size and eventually past it. Eliza put in a proper orchard along the south fence line, 10 trees the first year and 20 more the second, and by the time the oldest ones were producing reliably, the ranch had a second income stream that evened out the years when the beef market went soft. The house got its roof replaced. Properly, not patched. The barn's lean was corrected with new foundation work that Ben had engineered during a summer home from college. Walking his father through the structural logic with the patient thoroughness of someone who'd had good information conveyed to him without condescension and had learned to do the same. Hector died at 22, which was a very old age for a horse and in keeping with his general determination to do things on his own terms. Gideon buried him by the east fence line without ceremony and stood there for a while. And Eliza stood with him, and they didn't say much because there wasn't much to say, because grief is grief, whether it's for a person or an animal or a version of a life. And Hector had been present for a long time, and his absence was real. They got a new horse. She was young and uncertain and had a tendency to startle at nothing. And she and Gideon had a lengthy negotiation about mutual respect that she eventually conceded on terms favorable to both parties. He named her something sensible. Eliza privately called her something else, which the horse responded to, which settled the matter. It was in the 15th year, 15 years from the October wedding with the roses on the kitchen table, that the letter came. It arrived with the regular post, which Eliza collected from Millhaven on Thursdays when she went in for supplies. She read it on the wagon on the way home, which she was usually disciplined enough not to do with correspondence, but something about the letterhead made her unfold it before she'd consciously decided to. Consolidated Western Railway. A name she recognized. Everyone in the valley recognized it, because the rail expansion had been the major conversation in 3 counties for the better part of 2 years, and the route options were well known, and Cedar Creek sat precisely in the middle of the most favorable one. The letter was professional and respectful and made a very large offer. She read it twice, but then she folded it carefully and put it in her coat pocket and drove the rest of the way home thinking about what it meant. Not the money, though the money was significant enough to be serious, but what it meant about the thing they'd built, and what that thing was worth to someone who had never been here for any of it. Gideon was at the barn when she pulled in. He came to take the horse's head, which he still did after 15 years, one of those habits of consideration so ingrained they'd become invisible. "There's a letter," she said. "From the railway." His hand stilled on the bridle. She held it out. He took it, read it standing right there in the yard. She watched his face move through what it moved through. Surprise, then calculation, then something more complicated. He finished and looked up. "That's a significant number," he said. "It is. They want the whole property, the house, the orchard, all of it." I read it. He folded the letter. His eyes moved across the yard. The barn, the house, the orchard along the south fence, the garden where something was always growing in the months that allowed it. "What do you want to do?" he said. She looked at the same things he was looking at. The barn that didn't lean anymore. The house that had been old bone color when she'd first seen it and was now properly painted white again, the color it was supposed to be. The rose bushes along the south fence, blooming even now in late September, the 2 survivors from that first winter grown large and tangled and completely indifferent to the opinions of anyone who doubted them. She thought about the kitchen table where she'd done accounts through 2 droughts and 5 crises, the hallway floorboard that hadn't squeaked in 15 years, the east fence that Ben had rebuilt so thoroughly the summer he was 15 that it had never needed significant work since, the south field where she'd broken concrete hard ground with a pickaxe before dawn, by lamplight, with Gideon beside her doing the same. She thought about May's notebook, about Clara's hands cutting 4 roses for a jar on the wedding table, about Ben's voice saying it's about time over his breakfast eggs, about a small girl in a nightgown telling her that her chest got tight sometimes and it was easier to sit up. She thought about Black Hollow, about a street and a crowd and 30 faces and the particular sound of silence that feels like verdict. "No," she said. Gideon looked at her. "We're not selling," she said. Clearly, without anger, without drama, just the fact of it. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. Once. Like something had been confirmed that he'd already suspected. "We should tell them in person," he said. "The railway. It's respectful." "Agreed. I'll write back and arrange a meeting." "Good." He pocketed the letter and went back to the horse. Eliza went inside. She put the kettle on and stood at the kitchen window looking at the garden. May's bean plant long since gone, the corner where it had been now part of the expanded herb section, and felt the specific quietness of a decision that doesn't require any more discussion because both people already know what they're made of. They went to Millhaven the following week and met with the railway representatives in a proper office with a proper table, and men in pressed clothing who had the manner of people accustomed to getting what they wanted through the application of enough money. They were polite men, professional. They'd done their research. They knew the acreage, the water rights, the production history, the strategic value of Cedar Creek's position in the proposed route. "We're prepared to increase our offer," the senior representative said when Gideon had explained their position. He named a new number. It was larger. Eliza looked at the man across the table. He was perhaps 40, well-fed, with the particular confidence of someone who had rarely been told no by people in the economic position that Cedar Creek had occupied 15 years ago, when this story might have gone differently. "I understand the offer," she said, "and I want to be direct with you, because I think you've been professional and you deserve a direct answer." She paused. "That ranch is not for sale. Not at this number, and not at the next one. It's not a negotiation. It's not a starting position." The man studied her. "Mrs. Mercer, the economic benefit to your family." "I know the economic benefit," she said. "I've done the arithmetic. I've been doing the arithmetic on that property for 15 years, in circumstances a great deal harder than this one." She held his gaze. "What you're offering is money. What you're asking for is everything we built with it. Those aren't the same thing, and no number makes them the same thing." Silence across the table. Gideon had not said anything through this exchange. He was watching her in the way he sometimes watched her when she was doing something he hadn't known she was capable of, and had since stopped being surprised by, but still paid attention to. The senior representative looked at his colleague, then back at Eliza. "I see," he said. Not unfriendly, almost, she thought, with a kind of recognition. "Then we'll pursue the alternate routing." "That seems wise," she said. They shook hands. The railway men left. Gideon and Eliza walked out of the office into the Millhaven Main Street, a busier street than Black Hollow had ever been, with more people and more noise and a hardware store on the corner that hadn't existed when she'd first ridden through this valley. He stopped on the sidewalk. "That," he said, "was something to see. It was just talking." "You know it wasn't just talking." She looked at him. 15 years, and the face she knew better than her own was still, occasionally, capable of looking at her the way it had in that office, with something that was attention and something that was pride, and something that was, underneath both, a specific and unperformed love that had been built from actual materials rather than borrowed feeling. "Come on," she said. "I want to stop at Calder's before we head back." He caught her hand as they walked, which he did sometimes, unselfconsciously, and they walked down the Millhaven Main Street in the October light, the way people walk when they have somewhere to be and aren't in a hurry to get there. The sign went up the following spring. Ben had made it during a visit, proper woodworking, stained and sealed against the weather, mounted on new posts at the ranch entrance, where the old, faded sign had been for as long as anyone could remember. Gideon had suggested the words. Eliza had approved them. The children, all 5 of them home for the occasion in a complicated logistical achievement that May had organized with the thoroughness she brought to everything, had been present for the installation. Cedar Creek Ranch, not for sale. It was Sam who'd suggested the second line. He'd said it quietly, in the way Sam said things, but everyone heard it. They added it. Cedar Creek Ranch, not for sale, built by those who stayed. Clara stood at the new sign for a long time after the others had gone in for supper. Eliza came and stood beside her. The evening was cool, the sky going that deep blue before dark, and the roses along the south fence had been cut back for winter and would come back in the spring the way they always did now, reliable and unhurried, on their own schedule. "I used to think," Clara said, "that when you came here, that my father had made a mistake, that it was, I don't know, an arrangement, something practical and slightly sad." "It was practical," Eliza said. "It wasn't sad," Clara said. She turned to look at her. "You know what it was? Looking back now?" She paused. "It was the bravest thing both of you did. Just staying, just deciding it was worth it and staying." Eliza looked at the sign, at the name of the place on it, solid and plain. She thought about all the ways she had not planned for this life, all the ways it had been thrust at her by circumstances she hadn't chosen. A father who counted money into a stranger's hand, a town that had made up its mind and stopped looking. She had not walked into Cedar Creek Ranch with a vision. She'd walked in with 2 canvas bags and the capacity to wash dishes and not leave when things got hard. She had stayed because staying was the only thing that felt true. And the stain had made all of this. The house that fit her now, the way a worn coat fits. The land she knew, the way you know a person's face. The man who held her hand on Millhaven's sidewalks. The 5 people in that kitchen right now who had her fingerprints all over who they were. Not because she'd tried to shape them, but because she'd simply been there, steadily, through all of it. "Your mother would be so proud of all of you," Eliza said. "And I am too. Both things are true." Clara put her arm through hers, the way she'd started doing in recent years. A quiet, unselfconscious physical claim that still, even after everything, caught Eliza slightly off guard in the best way. They stood at the sign together while the sky darkened and the light in the kitchen window went warm and yellow behind them. Inside, through the glass, she could see Gideon at the kitchen table listening to something Sam was explaining with the particular focused attention he gave to the people he loved. May at the counter, already pulling something out to make notes about. Nora's voice carrying over all of it, telling a story to Ben that was apparently getting funnier the longer it went on, because Ben's expression was losing its battle with itself. The lamp on the table, the roses under the south fence, dormant and patient. The south field that had been concrete and dead and had come back. The creek, not loud but audible, running in its proper bed. All of it built from nothing much. A broken arrangement, hard ground, bad water. A family that was grieving and suspicious and so worn down by loss they barely knew how to accept something new. All of it built from showing up, again and again in the early mornings, and the middle of the night fevers and the long August crises, and the ordinary Tuesdays when nothing happened that would make a story, but that were the actual substance of a life. Black Hollow was a long way behind her. The town that had watched her father count money. The crowd that had found it unremarkable. The woman they had decided, collectively and without much consideration, was worth very little. She thought of them sometimes. Not with anger, mostly, though the anger had been real and had taken a long time to lay down properly. Mostly, she thought of them the way you think of a place you've traveled through on the way to somewhere else. It had been real. It had happened. And then she had ridden away from it on a wagon with a bad-tempered gray horse and a man she didn't know, into a life she hadn't planned, and she had made something of it that no crowd and no verdict and no public arrangement could touch. Clara squeezed her arm. "Come inside," she said. "It's getting cold." Eliza looked at the sign one more time. At the name. At the words underneath it that Sam had suggested and that were, she thought, exactly right. Built by those who stayed. She turned and went inside into the warmth and the noise and the lamp-lit kitchen, and the door closed behind her with the particular sound of a home that knows you.